Alright, hey guys, Michael here. So today I'm going to be talking about genetically modified crops and some of the debate, some of the controversy that has surrounded their cultivation for the past couple decades. So let's go ahead and just start out with some food for thought, no pun intended. About 50% of all soy crops grown worldwide is genetically modified soy. Soy is a very important, very prolific crop, a lot more prolific than a lot of people realize. It's the source of a lot of important additives in modern processed food, and it is considered a delicacy in a lot of Asia. It has another name, edamame. However, despite that statistic and despite the widespread controversy and debate around genetically modified crops, less than 1% of farmers worldwide actually grow GM crop. To expand on some of the lack of widespreadedness of genetically modified crops, only about 10 countries in the world account for 98% of GM crop. A couple of those are the US, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. Argentina's in there too, just to name a couple. However, all these countries more or less are in North and South America. Europe and Africa are largely GM-free. Europe is GM-free primarily because of ethical concerns and concerns as to their safety, as well as just pushback from farmers in general and the consumer population. And Africa is GM-free because Europe's politics heavily influence African politics. And for the record, the most common genetic modification in crops, and almost 100% of GM crops are modified in this way, is herbicide resistance. That is without a doubt the most common and genetic modification, and it is the one that we will focus on in this presentation. Alright, so to go over some of the pros of genetically modified crops, the cultivation of herbicide-resistant GM crops often results in less pesticide use. This might sound counterintuitive, but the reason behind it is that use of only one unselective herbicide that kills everything except for the herbicide-resistant crop it is intended to protect is going to result in significantly less herbicide use, which will result in significantly less herbicide runoff into the surrounding environment and significantly less herbicide in your produce than the use of multiple selective herbicides that are designed to only kill certain weeds and not the crop itself. So ultimately, the use of GM crops simplifies the use of herbicide. Secondly, the adoption of GM crops on farms often correlates with greener farming practice. This can include greener tillage practices or tilling practices that preserve the natural soil structure, and it can also include the use of less diesel fuel in the spread of herbicide, watering crops, tilling them, harvesting them, and such. And because of the use of less herbicide and because of the reduction in damage as a result to herbicide or proliferation of weeds and better tillage practices, genetically modified crops very often bring profit to a farmer's pocket because less damage means higher yield, which means more money for farmers that choose to adopt GM crops. And yield also means benefit to the general population. In fact, speaking of population, a lot of the heralds of genetic modification technology insist that genetically modified crops will be the solution to overpopulation, and that we will not be able to support the coming exponential growth of human population without them. But without further ado, let's move on to some of the cons of genetically modified crops. The biggest argument against genetically modified crops currently, arguably, is the development of superweeds. Now, nobody is out here actually developing these superweeds. These superweeds are just simply weeds that have adapted through natural selection, through the random mutation of genes, to become resistant to the single herbicide that is being used on these fields of GM crops. And these superweeds, well, they grow like weeds and can spread across fields into multiple farms, and can almost create just these epidemics of weeds that these farms that only use one type of herbicide are unequipped to fight. And, well, going out there and pulling the weeds themselves just simply isn't an option when you have massive acres upon acres upon acres of land. An additional con to GM crops is that they can be considered something of a premium crop, as farms that cultivate GM crops buy new seed every year, and that can be an expense that a lot of farms that are economically harder off will not be able to afford. This can result in kind of an exclusion factor, which can cause some lesser farms to go out of business, because if genetically modified crops are truly a superior crop, then they simply will not be able to compete. An additional concern that a lot of people have are legal concerns. Genetically modified crops found growing in the fields of farmers that did not purchase seed, whether that's through legitimate theft, which is quite rare, or in the case of seeds being transferred from field to field through the blowing of the wind, seed companies can sue these farms for growing their seed, which is their intellectual property. And that could, once again, cause a lot of these lesser farms to go out of business. And finally, a lot of people have raised health concerns. The general consumer population has raised concern about the safety of the consumption of GM produce itself, and that health risk could be expressed in multiple ways, whether that's the actual process of genetically modifying a organism itself, or the introduction of proteins that weren't there before, which could become potential allergens that have not been seen before. And regardless of the fact that the cultivation of GM crops actually reduces herbicide use, a lot of consumers don't believe this, and they believe that GM crops are going to have more herbicide in their system, whether that's through soil absorption or just simply from the misinformation that genetically modified crops are being watered with herbicide. But overall, there is good associated with the cultivation of genetically modified crops, and there is certainly bad. Regardless, biotechnology will continue to influence human progress for centuries to come. That is undoubted. This technology is just simply too powerful for us to ignore. And in the coming decades, we are going to have to settle these practical issues of the superweed, the potential issues of long-term consumption and exposure to GM crops, and ultimately the ethical issue with tampering with what many believe is not meant to be tampered with. But in the end, I would just like to thank you for listening to me talk for a quarter of an hour as part of this Earth and Environmental Systems project. It has been a pleasure to make this video, and I hopefully look forward to making maybe some kind of project similar to this in the future. So regardless of if you are a grader or if you clicked on this video out of pure chance, thank you for watching and thank you for sticking around to the end. This is me signing off. Goodbye.